Before the Battle of the Black Gate, Sauron sent forth his servant, the Mouth of Sauron, to negotiate with the host of the West. Negotiate is perhaps too generous a term. It was more the Mouth of Sauron gloating about the fact that Frodo had been captured, and that if the captains of the West ever wanted to see their friend again, they would have to accept Sauron's peace terms. So in this video, we look at Sauron's peace terms. What were they? What was the reason for them? What would have happened if the West accepted them? And most importantly, could Sauron actually be trusted? Okay, so when the Mouth of Sauron is speaking to the captains of the West, he reveals that the Hobbit has been captured in Mordor. He shows, as proof, Frodo's mithril coat and his elven cloak, as well as Sam's barrow blade. This causes the people present to assume that the quest to destroy the One Ring has failed, and that they are all doomed. The Mouth of Sauron continues, stating that Frodo will be tortured to the point of being completely broken, and only then he will be released, to reveal to everyone what has been done to him. The Mouth says that this future can only be avoided if Sauron's terms are accepted. The rabble of Gondor and its deluded allies shall withdraw at once beyond the Anduin, first taking oaths never again to assail Sauron the Great in arms, open or secret. All lands east of the Anduin shall be Sauron's forever, solely. West of the Anduin, as far as the Misty Mountains and the Gap of Rohan, shall be tributary to Mordor, and men there shall bear no weapons, but shall have leave to govern their own affairs. But they shall help to rebuild Isengard, which they have wantonly destroyed, and that shall be Sauron's, and there his lieutenant shall dwell. Not Saruman, but one more worthy of trust. Okay, so the way these terms are framed is obviously utter bullshit. It implies that the Free Peoples were the aggressors, and that Sauron is negotiating for his own security by getting them to swear an oath not to attack him ever again. Adding that all lands east of the Anduin will be Sauron's forever is implying that Gondor was actively contesting them. With the exception of Ithilien, Gondor hadn't really projected force beyond the Anduin in over 1,000 years. But despite the fact that it's completely rewriting history and ignoring the part that Sauron was the aggressor, these are the nicest part of the terms. The next part of the terms demands some real concessions. Firstly, it requires that all of the lands between the Anduin and the Misty Mountains become tributary to Sauron. What the tributes would be exactly is unknown, probably mineral wealth and food, and then specialized resources such as horses from Rohan or skilled artisans from Gondor who would be forced to labor for Sauron. Secondly, Sauron's terms dictate that none of the men living in these lands shall have any weapons. In other words, complete and utter military disarmament. That said, Sauron does offer a little something, that despite being disarmed and being tributaries, the people in these lands would have leave to govern their own affairs. This is worth something, right? As long as the terms were maintained, people in Gondor and Rohan could, for the most part, retain the same livelihoods they had before, and keep the same leaders. That said, they would not be without observation, because first, they would have to rebuild Isengard, and there a lieutenant of Sauron would dwell. The Mouth of Sauron fancied himself for that position. If you merely look at the terms and think of nothing else, you might think that they aren't actually that bad. Sure, Gondor and its allies would be disarmed and forced to pay tribute, and to acknowledge Sauron as their overlord, but that's a small price to pay when the alternative is seemingly total annihilation. And total annihilation was guaranteed. Gondor and its allies could not win a conventional war against Sauron, hence the gamble with destroying the One Ring. But there's one problem. Sauron is a liar and a deceiver who cannot be trusted, so his peace deal is pretty much worthless. In all likelihood, Sauron sent forth these terms knowing full well that they wouldn't be accepted. Aragorn could not and would not accept peace, regardless of the terms that Sauron offered. First and foremost, Sauron believed that Aragorn had the One Ring. Why else would he be so arrogant as to march on Mordor itself with such a small army? If Aragorn was wielding the One Ring, then he was being deluded into believing that he could truly overcome Mordor, so there's no way he's going to accept peace, because he believes that he now has the upper hand in the conflict. And if Sauron believes Aragorn has the One Ring, he's not going to allow Aragorn to live beyond the day. Secondly, Aragorn's destiny was to defeat Sauron, restore Arnor and Gondor, and become king. At this point in time, he was Gondor's de facto leader. He had won the support of the kingdom's leadership and people by helping secure victory at the Battle of the Pelennor Fields, and then revealing that he had the healing hands of a king by saving people like Faramir and Éowyn from certain death. After spending his entire life building up to this moment, he isn't then just going to surrender at the first opportunity. That would be a certain way to kill any chance of him claiming the throne in Gondor. So why did Sauron even send forth the Mouth of Sauron in the first place if he knew that the terms were pointless? Well, there's probably a few reasons. One, the Mouth would get a up-close and personal look at the man that was trying to become king. Secondly, the Mouth would get to gloat about the capture of Frodo in Mordor. Even though Sauron didn't know about Frodo's quest, the capture of their friend would still demoralize the captains of the West. Basically, it's just Sauron being cruel. And although not explicitly stated, sending forth a peace delegation would further paint the West as the aggressors, especially in front of Sauron's mannish allies. They were the ones marching on Mordor, and if Sauron's peace offer was rejected, then what could Sauron do other than send forth his armies? So yeah, the Mouth of Sauron was sent forth as political theatre, and both Sauron and the captains of the West knew that neither side would be willing to back down at this point. But let's ask the question, what if Aragorn did actually accept Sauron's peace terms? We can't know for certain what would happen. One thing that might occur to Sauron is that if Aragorn was genuinely willing to surrender and make peace, then he probably did not possess the One Ring, because, as I said earlier, Aragorn with the One Ring would be deluded into believing that he could win. If Sauron comes to that conclusion, then destroying Aragorn then and there isn't a necessity. It would still very much be in character for Sauron to accept the surrender and then send out his army to destroy the host of the West anyway. While Sauron isn't Morgoth who indiscriminately destroys, he's still vindictive and capable of great acts of cruelty. But at the same time, I can't say with absolute certainty that Sauron wouldn't honour the peace agreement. Not because he's honourable, but because it's a easier, safer route. Remember, despite Sauron having the clear advantage in the war, he still routinely had great doubts. Having your enemies disarmed makes them much easier to conquer. At first, Sauron might honour the peace agreement. The lords of Gondor and Rohan would bend the knee, their armies would be disbanded, and Isengard would be rebuilt with the Mouth of Sauron as its probable ruler. But while Sauron did have a history of allowing his mannish subjects a fair amount of independence provided they served and worshipped him, let's not make the mistake of assuming that he would extend this courtesy to Gondor and Rohan. After all, Sauron hated the descendants of Elendil and their allies, and had spent thousands of years attempting to destroy them. He isn't just then going to let them live, provided they behave well. So after a few years, or maybe even just a few months, I wouldn't be surprised if Sauron marches his armies in, reason or no, and finishes the job. Gondor and Rohan would lose any independence, most of the people would be killed and enslaved, and Sauron would move in his more loyal subjects to rule over what remained. And I don't think Sauron would be willing to stop at the Misty Mountains either. He still had unsettled business with the elves, so places like Rivendell and Lindon would also be on the target list. Sauron would march to the shores of the sea. So, as I said earlier, Sauron's peace deal was worthless. It wasn't really a serious offer. Sauron knew that the captains of the West would reject the offer, and the captains of the West knew that anything from Sauron's mouth couldn't really be trusted. If by some insanity the peace offering was accepted, I don't think it would change the final outcome. Sauron hated Gondor and its allies, and he desired to be the god king of all of Middle-earth. Sooner or later, for one reason or another, he would have broken the peace and resumed his destruction and complete subjugation of his enemies. No, there was no legitimate shot at peace. This was a fight to the death, and both sides knew it. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed it, or at least found it interesting. An interesting fact, in Road to Middle-earth, Tolkien scholar Thomas Shippey likened Sauron's peace terms to the ones that were imposed on France in 1940. Half the country occupied, the other half disarmed, and that disarmed half ended up being occupied only 2 years later. Cheers, farewell, and remember, the timing of this video is absolutely a coincidence. Definitely a coincidence.